Good evening, everyone. It's sort of a nice Indian summer, warm afternoon, evening, so it's hard to get started. But I'm conscious of the fact we've only got through until 7:30, and we're going to cover some material that's going to keep us really busy and engaged. I think we're going to get to 7:30 before we even know what's happened. I want to start with acknowledgement of country, which is always important, and it's certainly important when talking about the topics we're talking about tonight. So we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the unceded lands and waterways on which Deakin University does business. We pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders and present and emerging leaders of the Wada Wurrung country, Eastern Ma country, and Wurundjeri country, which is where our campuses are located. We're talking tonight about a failed space of multiculturalism, which is a very cryptic and provocative title that will become clear in a minute, because there's quite a difference between the way we think and talk about multiculturalism in Australia and the way in which the term is used or not used in the UK. But that'll all come clear very quickly. So that comes from a book that our first speaker has just been involved in co-authoring, and Paul will walk us through the background of that study in the north of England, along that corridor between Manchester and Leeds and Bradford, and the particular circumstances that put this question mark about what's happening with diverse communities. Let me briefly introduce our panelists, though, because I don't want to take any more of their time, because I want to get into Paul's presentation and our discussion. So I'll go through all the panelists. So Paul Thomas, who's visiting us from Huddersfield, where he's Professor of Youth Policy, Youth and Policy, I should say, and Associate Dean of Research, Innovation and Knowledge Exchange. Paul comes out of a background of working with youth, has come from practitioner into academic space, done a lot of work on responding to extremism and to diversity. And this latest study he'll talk about in a minute, and he's visiting us as part of his work with Michelle Grossman, who can't be here because she's down with a bronchial infection, but working with the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies. Robin Scott, I think all of our speakers here almost need no introduction, but I want to put on the record their background. So very briefly, Robin comes out of the world of politics and policy, now working with us at ADI as a industry professor, but of course he was from the Victorian government and from the seat of Preston. He was Minister for Finance, Assistant Treasurer, but also Minister for Multicultural Affairs, which in the ears of Paul will sound strange, but we'll unpack that sort of strange difference between the UK and Australia in a minute. And Robert was in government until last year, and now is helping us at ADI to get a sense around how we engage with the world of policymakers and government. Sulin Kwek, I think you would probably all know that Sulin has spent 25 years in community and government sectors. She's Executive Manager of Knowledge, Advocacy and Service Innovation at the Centre for Multicultural Youth, and she'll speak about what that NGO does and their work. But she oversees the Centre for Multicultural Youth Policy Research and Advocacy on emerging issues with young people, working particularly with refugees and asylum seekers, migrant youth. Fetty is, of course, Director of ADI at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. He has held since 2008 a chair in migration and intercultural studies, and we'll come back to that word intercultural in a minute. Also, the UNESCO Chair for Comparative Research on Cultural Diversity and Social Justice, very closely tied to the work of ADI. And so that means he's not only advised Australian, Victorian, and federal governments, but also been engaged deeply with the UN, and so advising UN agencies and member countries around the world. And he was elected a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences in 2020. There's a lot more I can say about all the panelists, but I think there's no need for further introduction because it'll come out in the discussion, and their particular backgrounds and their particular expertise and experience is very relevant to unpacking. I think collectively are optimistic about what we'd call in Australia multiculturalism, but there's this enigmatic question of the title that Paul has chosen for his book, and he'll unpack it and explain that, and then that'll help us understand what some of the challenges and issues are, not just in the UK, but here, where for all of our optimism, there's a lot of headwinds and problems. So Paul, I'll get you to come up and come through your slides quickly, and we'll then move into our discussion.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening, everyone. What I'd like to do sort of briefly then in the first few minutes is just give you a sense of what this is all about. I'd like to sort of outline the key focus of a recent book that I co-authored with two of my University of Huddersfield colleagues regarding a particular region of the north of England and multiculturalism in that region. And I guess I want to be reasonably provocative about the issues there. And I'm interested to hear what relevance or lack of relevance there is for multiculturalism as practice and as policy here in Australia. So that's the book. The book directly addresses a thesis that many of the towns and cities, indeed the region as a whole, are what has been termed a failed space of multiculturalism. And this supposed failure of multiculturalism comes in two forms. The British sociologist Stuart Hall talked about the double meaning of multiculturalism. So one is multiculturalism as policy. Well, in 2011, the then UK Prime Minister David Cameron said that multiculturalism had failed in the UK. At the same event, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the same thing. It was news to a lot of us that Germany had ever practiced multiculturalism, but she still said it. And similar positions have been echoed by other North European politicians, such as in the Netherlands and Denmark. But the other meaning of multiculturalism is obviously the daily reality of an ethnically and faith diverse society. And the suggestion in our region is that that hasn't worked, that it's not working, that there are separation, tensions, and hatred between communities. And of course, when politicians criticised the policy, and Cameron was referring to the policy of multiculturalism, which he was blaming for the separation and tension, but people hear criticism of the very existence of ethnic diversity. And that is one of the concerns. This failed space concept has been applied to a number of towns and districts in Northwest Europe, such as outer banlieue of Paris or the Molenbeek area of Brussels, places that become symbolic of racial and faith segregation, of racial tensions, and of being crucibles of violent extremism. So in our town, in our region, towns such as Bradford, Dewsbury, and Oldham have become these markers of failure and of tension, both nationally and internationally. Let me say very, very clearly that myself and my fellow authors completely reject this thesis. We're much more positive about the existence of multiculturalism and the success of multiculturalism. We don't think it's failing. But we want, in doing that, we want to identify four themes that I'm very briefly going to mention. So one is ethnic segregation. The second is the relationship between multiculturalism and place and economics, the economic experience. So we're making a case for political economy. We also want to talk about the so-called white backlash. And finally, briefly, the role of policy. Firstly, where is this region? Well, as was helpfully pointed out before the event start, I should probably describe it for the sports lovers amongst you as the rugby league corridor, really. The M62 is the motorway, but it's basically the rugby league area. But more importantly, this area was the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. It's where the textile industry really was created. And all these towns between Leeds and Manchester were once thriving industrial sort of hubs, all based on the textile industry. The fact that there is multiculturalism in these towns is because workforces were recruited, particularly from the South Asian subcontinent, to work in textiles. The fact that the industry then went is part of the issue. If you prefer motorway maps, there's a sort of road atlas type version of the same thing. So in our region, this talk of failure is focused on race riots, and we have had genuine race riots, on links to violent extremism, to significant spatial segregation. Most ethnic minority communities in the region's towns and cities are South Asian background, mainly Muslim, and implicit in these claims of failure, both in our region, but also across Europe, this failure of multiculturalism has largely focused on Muslims and the supposed trope that it is impossible for Muslims to integrate. Arguing that the sociologist Stan Cohen talked about moral panics, and we argue that there's been a European moral panic about the ability of Muslim communities to integrate, which again, we reject absolutely. So we reject that for several reasons. Firstly, we've deliberately taken a regional level analysis because a lot of work on multiculturalism either looks at local areas or it looks at national pictures. We've tried to look at in between. That allows us to look at economic and social trajectories from the prosperity I described to the recession and the lack of industry that we now have. So we're arguing that political economy matters, and too often it's painted out of any discussion of race and multiculturalism. We also look at urban studies to argue that the concern and the moral panic about Muslim integration is profoundly ahistorical. And here we're very much drawing on Chicago's school studies of sociology about how migrant integration happens over many decades. I should say that my co-author, Pete Sanderson, is actually from Adelaide originally. His family background is German Lutheran. He's the 5th generation of German Lutheran migrants, and he's the first one to marry out of the German Lutheran community that settled in South Australia, and that helps give us that particular perspective about longevity of migrant integration. I don't want to dwell on this, but there have been a number of events in our region that have actually sort of created this perception of failure, and I think a lot of them be familiar to some of you. They involve parental boycotts of schools by different communities because of perceived mixing, the burning of Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verses, in Bradford, which kicked off that international focus, riots in 2001 that were genuinely race riots in that white and Asian communities physically fought each other, considerable political manifestations, votes for far-right groups, and then a very racialised support for Brexit in these areas, and also the highly racialised understanding of things like child sexual exploitation cases in a variety of northern cities. And of course, links to terrorism. The 7/7 attackers came from Leeds and Dewsbury. And we've also had the murder of Joe Cox MP, who's one of our local MPs. I'm currently working with Joe's sister, who took over her seat as the local MP. So we identify those 4 key themes, and let me just very briefly then sort of talk about them. The first is segregation and tensions. Riots in 3 towns in 2001, 2 of which could be called race riots, really shone a light on very substantial ethnic segregation, not just in these towns, but in many parts of Britain. And they actually proved to be a watershed in UK multiculturalist policy. Indeed, the towns in our region have the highest levels of physical ethnic segregation using the traditional academic measures. The resulting government report, the Cantor report, identified the concept of parallel lives, a separation which is beyond residential segregation, but also refers to cultural and identity separation, a total separation in head as well as in place. Now, the report did not suggest self-segregation, but it was understood in that way, and it raised issues about agency, whether communities are choosing not to mix, choosing not to live together, and are deliberately avoiding things. Our research with young people, I should say the book is based on a body of research over 20 years by us all and with colleagues. And last time I was at Deakin in 2019, I talked about our research with young people, and that highlighted that when there is contact between white and ethnic minority young people, often the circumstances of that contact leads to highly racialized and highly negative experiences of that contact. That 2001 watershed led to a profound national policy shift, moving away from the language of multiculturalism, and the UK has not used the term multiculturalism since. It's talked about community cohesion, about integration. It still talks about equality and diversity, but it does not use multiculturalism. In fact, very few European countries now use the term. The second issue is economic and social trajectory of the towns. Economic decline has become increasingly racialized in the perceptions of many residents. Here, once prosperous textile industries have disappeared, leaving marginalized, low-skilled, low-paid work for people of all backgrounds. In fact, an excellent study in Oldham of the Asian community there was titled "From Textile Mills to Taxi Ranks, from Secure Employment to Very Marginalised Employment, which is only within the community." So accordingly, the site of racial tensions and segregations in the UK has shifted from the big cities, where we had riots and tensions in the 70s and 80s. Now segregation and tension is in these small ex-industrial towns. The cities are seen as convivial cosmopolitanism in Paul Gilroy's terms. I'll just turn over. And our research shows that it leads to considerable racialisation of perceptions of economic decline. You know, some of the quotes there are from Dewsbury, a small town, an infamous town close to Huddersfield where I work. And what has happened here is industry has declined as the town has become more multiracial. And for certainly some of the white residents, they've seen one as causal of the other. I should also say that that economic decline has happened during the 50-year membership of the European Community, and that also became seen as causal of decline for some of those residents. The British sociologist Paul Gilroy talked about a British melancholia for empire, and that may well be true, but what we found was melancholy for a once prosperous and proud economic past that has now disappeared. Another issue is the white backlash. There's been a lot of discussion here about the white working class. It's a hugely problematic concept. It's very controversial. Firstly, because who is white is actually a fluid and historically changing concept. And the white working class, if they exist, certainly don't represent the whole of the working class, which of course is multiracial. But there is a genuine feeling in some parts of white communities in the region of unfairness, of being second-class citizens, and this runs very deep with some of them. It's been fueled by political agitation from national politicians and far-right protest groups as well. So riots in Oldham in 2001 were significantly triggered by feelings of unfairness in government regeneration and favouritism towards minority Asian communities, but were massively fueled by repeated incursions by far-right groups. So here there's a modern absence of concern about economic inequality and class inequality, and race seems to have filled the space of class. And what that has turned into is those variety of political manifestations that I mentioned earlier. There's a number of quotes here that I could highlight from our research, which are about markers of difference, about a racialized sense of space and territory, particularly emotions. There's a lot of the literature around far-right sort of protest groups and populism focused on the role of emotions. And it's clear from our research that there are emotional feelings in these white majority communities about change that have taken a racialized and a racist form and have led to a pessimism about ethnic diversity, about contact, and about multiculturalism. That includes really strong feelings around competition over social goods, particularly such as social housing and other welfare benefits. And there's been research by the Open Society Foundation right across Western Europe that's found that very consistently. But what we should say is that consistently across Western European countries, neoliberalism has seen the size of the welfare state, the volume of social goods on offer has declined markedly. So here, communities feel like they are fighting over access to these social goods, and that is the context of it. The last comment I'd make briefly, and hopefully more optimistically, is about policy. The historical policy context of British multiculturalism, and here I think is the difference that we'll get into in the debate, is that it's been limited, partial, and often permissive at the national level, in that it's been left to local government to enact and to devise ways of doing things locally. It's not been overtly nationally directed. So there have been phases of national framework policies with much more activist equality measures from the 1980s, but it's still been that local enactment and implementation that's been key. Despite this this pessimism. Post-2001, we've seen a new phase with the abandonment of the language of multiculturalism and attacks on the concept, leading to some critics saying we've seen the death of British multiculturalism. That death is much exaggerated, though, and we reject that. Equality measures persist and have deepened. For instance, working in higher education, we're under a great deal of government pressure to focus on ethnic differentials in attainment and achievement at all levels of education, and to explain any differentials in those ethnic achievement levels. And I should say, I previously worked for the government's Commission for Racial Equality prior to being an academic. The measures that we were arguing for in the 1990s as that body have been deepened and enacted through all aspects of British life. It's just that we don't dare say the word multiculturalism. So that this new policy focus on cohesion and integration has been described as a rebalancing by Professor Tariq Madood, a focus on commonality alongside that need of equality for particular groups. And that move away from the language has been consistent across a lot of Western European countries, where some white voters see multiculturalism as a term and as a concept, meaning favoritism for minority communities, whether that's right or wrong. But nationally in the UK, ethnic segregation continues to break down. Increasing numbers of citizens and families are multiracial, and racist parties gain no electoral traction. However, in the absence of both an overt focus on economic and spatial equality and a public support for multiculturalism, racial divides and racialised perceptions of life continue to have strength in regions and towns like ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that elegant summary, Paul. There's so much there that is familiar and yet strange. I'm going to get some comments from the other panelists, starting with Fetty and then Sue Lynn, and then Robin. Because, as I said at the outset, I mean, if our view of British society is based from family visits or academic exchanges or watching BBC sitcoms, we don't get this sort of darkness coming through. We think of multiculturalism in a rather positive way as something that's working, that's not failing. And I know that you're being deliberately provocative with your title, but Fetty will help us unpack some of those differences.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much, Paul. That was very specific, but yet comprehensive in relation to your research in the UK. I always like to start from the beginning of the story. And I think the story with multiculturalism really needs to be understood in terms of the historical context within which this ism has really emerged. And as we all know, the whole notion of cultural diversity being embodied within a theory, an ideology, really came about following the civil rights movement of the 1960s. There was a huge, obviously, move towards emancipatory politics, form of politics, whether it's based on gender equality, it's racial equality, dealing with colonialism, post-colonialism, but also in terms of a lot of the socio-political struggles of the time. So multiculturalism emerged in that context that is really a progressive basis for articulating a social policy, which the aim of which was really to ensure that there is proper recognition of diversity within multi-ethnic societies, but also that recognition should be the template upon which we devise a different way of relating to one another. So for me, that is the ideological side of multiculturalism that unfortunately we've never been able to really fully implement within policies. I agree with Paul. The problem in the context of Europe, in the context of the UK, has been that we've very much confused multiculturalism as a philosophical ideal, which can be the basis of policy, with multicultural, if you like, demographics that start to shape European societies. So when Merkel, when Sarkozy, when Cameron of the UK spoke about the failure of multiculturalism, they were really speaking to the socio-demographic manifestation of diversity. Not so much that they spoke to a coherent set of policies that were driven centrally by those governments, and the aim of which was to ensure that there are some proper, if you like, provisions in space to deal with the growing diversity of post-World War II Europe. But what it means, really, it's on multiculturalism in many ways. If you look at the political theoretical side of multiculturalism, there are three fundamental, I think, notions that we need to come to grips with. There's the notion of equality, and I'll explain why that is extremely important. There's the notion of identity, and there's the notion of group differentiation. So when we talk about equality within multiculturalism, equality doesn't mean that we treat everyone the same. That is actually the wrong way of going about equality within a multiculturalist framework. Equality within a multicultural framework means that you recognize that different groups within society come to this social space, as Paul mentioned earlier, with different sets of circumstances, with different sets of disadvantages or forms of disadvantages, with different capabilities to fully integrate and fulfill their roles as active citizens. Therefore, as a state, you cannot take equality as simply treating everyone the same. You need to take equality as reflecting and recognizing the differential starting points of every single person and every single group. Now, that is what we call deep equality in the cultural diversity literature. So it's about deep equality, or as we like to call it now, equity in many professional circles. The other related point to deep equality is group differentiation. And I think a lot of the issues that Paul was talking about really relate to how we deal with group differentiation. In liberal democracies, we've always placed the emphasis on individualization. That is, every individual has the right to articulate and claim and self-ascribe, if you want, their own identity and make those claims vis-a-vis the state. Now, within that dynamic, multiculturalism allows and creates a space for also collective or group claims, simply because there is an acceptance and understanding that individuals have that capacity for agentic self-ascribed identities, but also individuals want to be part of a collective or a group. And you can think of a lot of claims that are made collectively in many ways. And it's only when you make those claims collectively that you manage to redress structural inequalities. So it's linked to equality yet again. And the third point, of course, which is related to group differentiation and the problem of individualization, is identity. And I think in many, many cases within multiculturalist debates and discourses and discussions, we tend to think of identity in relation to difference. And difference is not really unpacked, because difference can be generated from within, that is within the group, or it can be generated from outside of that group. So when I'm talking about difference from within the group, that is an absolutely kind of natural manifestation of individual difference that all of us carry with us with regard to intersecting forms of identity. So whether it's my history, my migration history, my faith background, my personal life story, etc., etc., etc. But the problem with multiculturalism that we've seen, or at least I should say, a problem with the way multiculturalism has been framed in the European context, is that the difference that comes from outside is what's creating a lot of problems. So when I say to you that I'm white, you're black, I'm automatically racializing you in ways that relates you to me in a very hierarchical, power-oriented manner. So it is that difference that is dictated by majoritarian groups that impose the notion of cultural identity on that minoritized group in ways that really wants to embed and sustain forms of inequalities. All of this really points to one thing. Before we can discuss meaningfully in ways that can progress the discussion forward in relation to what kind of multiculturalism, is it failing, is it not failing? Of course, the empirical evidence shows that by and large, the two most prominent states of multiculturalism, Australia and Canada, it is not really a big failure, because we still have about 75% of the population very much articulating positive views towards diversity and multiculturalism. But in all of those circumstances, what we need to understand is multicultural politics in Europe is very much driven by the everyday politics of managing diversity and everyday politics of managing European politics more generally. Whereas in other jurisdictions, the dynamics of these discussions have moved on, and the dynamics have shifted towards really wanting to ensure that we live in a truly multicultural society, not just having the socio-demographics that show diversity in terms of ethnic, racial, and religious differences. So I'll stop there, Greg, for the time being, and then we'll come to some more questions.
Thank you.
later on.
You've given us a lot to chew on, and I'll leave it to Sulin to unpack at the community practitioner level where this academic framing takes us.
I think I just have to leave you now. I'll try. So thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. How do I start to unpack it? I think one of the starting points for me, and this is what I hear often, is how do we understand equity? And I think you're absolutely right, Fathy. It's not about treating everyone the same, because we all don't start off at the same starting point. We all have got a different starting point. It's not a level playing field in that sense. So in terms of that equity, we have to think about difference. We have to think about the specificities of each group or individual that we come across and where their starting point is. And so I think the other point I want to raise, which you kind of touched on, Fathy, is also what I thought was really good with what you've raised with the research, is that the economics of it. So I think we talk about cultural diversity, and absolutely, if we talk about the demographics, and I'll be one of those people who's going to be on my bandwagon going, yes, we are at a turning point in Australia's demographic, because we have got 51.5% of our population who are born overseas or have got at least one parent born overseas. And the diversity is not just about where we come from. It's more than ever, if you look at the ABS stats, we are intermarrying much more than previous generations are. So in terms of individual understanding of diversity and of multiculturalism, I think it's a descriptive term in Australia, but I also think Australia, because what struck me too in terms of that research around the acceptance, 70 to 75% accepting multiculturalism, it didn't come from just the ether. Multiculturalism for me is an ongoing human project. And it comes from Australia's history of how we have talked about how our debates and discussion has been about multiculturalism, that we're at a point where I think sometimes I look at it, and I feel an old person here, and I look at a younger generation, I think, you can't take it for granted. It didn't just come up from nowhere. It came up from a lot of the struggles, a lot of the challenges, a lot of the heartache that went on in how we talk about multiculturalism and the values, and as a contested, it still is a contested side, but I think it should be one of our favorite challenges and our favorite projects as a community, because I think to let go of it and to say it's a failure is giving up on humanity. And the more I talk to young people, the more I listen to young people are saying to me, we can't just live within my own cultural community. I know almost every second person in the Somalian community, because we're so connected. Our parents make us want to know every other person in the Somalian community. I want to know others. I want to understand what the values are, how they look at the world, how they live their lives. We are young people in the sense of we've got common challenges as young people, but also common places where we have common interest and share a common humanity. So what does that common humanity look like? And they know, and I know it's not an easy challenge to have. And I think one of the challenges for Australia too, which is a bit different to the UK, is that we have got, thankfully, we've got a growing bigger and bigger conversation around where does Indigenous communities fit into our conversations about multiculturalism. And young people often say to us, what does it mean to be a migrant? To be a migrant who's come and lived in Australia because our parents have, and themselves as young people who are first generation young people, have seen the opportunities Australia has. And I think Australia, listening to the research findings and listening to Fathy and thinking about Europe, Australia is still a young country by comparison. Australia is still a growing nation in terms of how we see ourselves and how we describe ourselves. And I think part of that, trying to come to terms with that understanding of an Australian identity, much less an individual kind of all of us grappling with identity. How do we, as Australia, who is situated in this part of the world, how do we think about ourselves and how do we then project that identity? And I think very much so, going back to history of Australia again, we have come to a point where we have almost taken the multicultural discourse for granted. I think it's timely more than ever that we kind of put it back on the table and re-look at what previously we have described as values that we've attached to it, how we want to live our lives in Australia, and how do we want to deal with the challenges that come up for us, whether as older people in the community or young people. And I think when you talk about young people, I look at some of the research around the place, and you look at the research around Gen Z and Gen Y, they are more accepting than ever of difference, whether it's cultural difference or sexual difference or, difference in diet, whether someone's a vegan or he's still a meat eater. I think there's much more openness to have that conversation about what does that mean for ourselves as individuals, but also what it means for an Australian identity, where we are in that sense of being in that lovely, can I say, lovely and uncomfortable space of continuously having to rethink and not take for granted who are we as Australia. And I think I'll bring the economics back in the game, because one of the things that rears its head up all the time, Australia is great and fine at talking about multiculturalism, I think, but whenever we hit an economic bump along the road, some of the discomfort about our cultural diversity comes up. And we don't have to look far when we think about the pandemic and what it has brought up to the surface. And one of the things that people have talked about during pandemic is not just the virus that went around, but the other virus of racism reared its ugly head again. And when I talk to young people are competing for jobs. They are desperate to get jobs. They're competing for jobs with, and they say to me, I know, I'm telling you, this is not new. And I've still got young people that are saying to me, I think I'll just have to change my name, don't I? Not going on, try not to do that. But they say, look, I've written in 20, 30, 40, 50 job applications, and I think my name's a bit of a barrier. And I kind of think, how do we talk about and not conflate the issue of and not differentiate and not have one conversation about multiculturalism and another conversation about racism? I think there are that's the luxury we have in Australia, to still have that really robust and challenging conversation. And I would say in this digital transformation age that we're in, where young people and all of us as community members have more access than ever to information. And yes, there's a lot of misinformation that goes around the ether as well, but there's also a lot of information in there, because for people like me and other young people who have migrated, we still keep our connections with people overseas, and they tell us another story, and they tell back to us another story about Australia, and who Australia is. And that, how do we bring all that into a safe environment where we can have those challenging conversations? And I think, this is about time we do this. And us as older, I often think about the organization I live in, I work in, and I think, how do we, as people who've gone through those difficult conversations about multiculturalism in the past, and I'm one of them, how do I help the next generation to create that safe space? And I think all of us have got a responsibility here.
Thank you, Celine. It's a great and provocative starting point, and it is important we have this conversation, and we do have a safe space for it. So, Robin, where are we going? What do we have to do?
Well, I think I'd say a couple of things. I do agree with Fetty that by and large, as a political journey, multiculturalism is largely successful in a context, an Australian context, which it isn't. And I think there's, in some other societies, and I think there's a straw man element to some of the multicultural discourses, where multiculturalism is seen only as the sort of, to use some of the sociological language, bonding social capital, but actually it involves bridging social capital as well. And so the model you get in places like Australia or Canada, there's both. The multicultural policy is both about celebrating identity, but building bridges within societies between migrant communities and the opportunities that exist in the broader society. And it can't exist otherwise. And so I think it's really unfortunate that in some other societies, that element of the bridging role that multiculturalism has been ignored. And in fact, it's seen being as antithetical to multiculturalism. I think that's a mistake, a terrible error in public policy. I think the economics is really, really important. And I think in Australia, it's easy in one sense to talk about these issues because we have not faced some of the challenges that European societies have faced in the sort of after post-GFC. And then you had austerity, particularly in the UK context. And so our situation has been very different. I think we're heading into some challenging times. I think what is very useful out of this research, and I think something to focus on, is the sort of challenges that arise of relative decline in the people who I think white working class is a problematic term, but the people who self-identify in that way. And that's a really challenging issue. I think in Australia, it's a bit different because the economic geography is quite different. So while there has been a loss of manufacturing, it's been in a context of capital cities where there are other job opportunities. So it's not as if it's in most part, there's some exceptions, but that's largely the case. I think it's been buffeted. We've been lucky in some of those contexts. I think, though, there are significant elements. If you look at the last federal election, and it's not necessarily in the current context being contextualised around multiculturalism, but there's a populist elements rising, and there's an inversion of the voting base with less educated voters tending to vote more populist and higher educated voters tending to smaller liberal progressive, for want of a better way. And so there's an inversion across the Western world. And I think no one should take for granted the support for multiculturalism, because there are real risks that as sort of for centre-right parties, and I'll leave it so, and then you've got the more extreme parties, as their political base, who are more highly educated and wealthier, start to desert them, that there's this sort of Northern Wall strategy to go in the UK or Brexit strategy where you're using, and it hasn't in the immediate post-COVID world, those populist parties haven't been so focused on multiculturalism, but it's always there as a risk. So I think in responding, I think it's really important to see multiculturalism and support for multiculturalism being contextualised in broader economic geography issues, actually, to take up the point of Paul. And so you have to have multiculturalism that involves both the ability of people to self-define, and in a free society, that's pretty fundamental. If we're actually a democratic free society, people have the right, if they're living in peace, to define themselves. That's sort of core business of liberal democratic societies, which is often ignored by the critics of multiculturalism. But you have to have that bridging element to multiculturalism. It has to be about participation. And when I was a minister, a lot of research was done in government. You have contribution and belonging. You want to legitimate multiculturalism, give people who feel disengaged and alienated the ability to contribute to the society, and they'll feel they belong. And more than that, people will perceive them as belonging from the majority because they're seeing the contribution. So it's actually there's an economic element, which I think Paul has really importantly elucidated to any successful multicultural society, of having those engagements, ensuring that you don't have communities, whether they be migrant communities or in the existing populations, feeling that they are disengaged from the society and lacking opportunities, because the loss of relative economic social status is at the heart of populism. And that's the threat. You can't talk about multiculturalism and the threat of public policy without thinking of the opponents, because they certainly exist. And they may have run on COVID and COVID lockdowns at this most recent electoral cycle here in Australia, but that's not in their core views. They're very hostile to multiculturalism in many cases. So you have to understand that there are those populist elements who are essentially authoritarian in their instincts and would wish to fetter the ability of people to self-express in a way that is self-defining. So and reject that as a premise for how societies run. And we always have to be alive to those threats. And there are options, and I think we can succeed in that. I'm optimist, actually, ultimately, about Australian multiculturalism, because if you have that, if you can engage with communities, ensure that people are not economically left behind, do not feel that they are shut out of opportunities and are not experiencing relative loss of economic and social status, then I think you can head off the risks that have risen in so many other societies around the world. And we haven't had large-scale expressions of migrant sentiment, except for some terrible examples, but on a political stage. And you've got some examples of people's individual racism. But I think we can't take it for granted. And I think the work that Paul's done actually shines a really important light on those economic geographical elements of those and the relative decline of those cities as being a fuel of populist resentment towards, of course, people who are not responsible for that decline. And that misattribution of blame lies at the heart of the sort of populist authoritarian project. But we can't take that for granted, and we have to redouble our efforts. But we have to do so celebrating people, allowing people to celebrate their identity, but importantly, helping them have those bridges to the broader society that work in multiple directions, with that bridging social capital and responding to economic inequality and disadvantage wherever it lies.
Let's bring it back to the very sort of personal level. I mean, because it's good to speak about politics and it's good to speak economics, but every society has a problem with racism, and Australia has a problem with racism. Are we getting better, or is it not improving? And what are the things we should be doing to make it a place where we can have safe conversations and be respectful and appreciate difference? Freddie,
Yeah, I think, look, what do we say about racism? It has remained persistent in our society that there is a small segment of the population that since we started recording statistics basically through the ABS and later on through a lot of surveys and polling instruments, and we've seen initially consistently kind of 8% of the population who we can classify as racist, right? If you look at their attitudes towards migration, diversity, certain minorities. And that is against a majority of Australians, more than 80%, who would have very, very positive and progressive views around the same issues. Now, unfortunately, what's happened recently in the last, maybe over the last 2 decades in particular, and has accelerated over the last decade, is that all the research that has been done by many, many academic institutions, and including ours and other colleagues at other institutions, Western Sydney, Monash, etc., has shown that that number, unfortunately, has almost doubled. So we are seeing now a core 15%, more or less, of the population who articulate those views. You might say, oh, that's not a lot, really, when you think, but for a society that is now, for the first time ever in our modern history, we are a migrant majority society. That is more than 50% of the population are either born overseas or at least have one parent who's born overseas. I think that is symptomatic of many things. And it's symptomatic of the talk why multiculturalism has failed, between inverted commas, in Europe. And so what is that problem of racism that we have telling us? It's telling us that we haven't really addressed the key reforms in our society to function properly as a multicultural society, and as a multicultural state for that matter, not even society. So that the key institutions in our society not simply talk about diversity and celebrate diversity and accept diversity, but much more than that. They have the key governance principles reflected in the way we are governed as a society. So when the Australian Human Rights Commission did that survey across the top 200 corporations in Australia, as listed in the ASX, the finding in that survey that almost 98% of the CEOs of those companies all come from the same ethno-cultural background, basically white, predominantly English-speaking, male in most cases. That tells you everything you need to know. That you couple that with the level of political representation in our parliament, which has improved recently, I must say. This current parliament is far more representative than the one before it. The one before it was shocking in terms of how little it resembled the people it was meant to represent. So when you put all of those things together, you know, the way our media is run and organized, the way our political system has functioned, the way our corporate governance has developed, the way we have not dealt with the economic redistribution aspect of the discussion, all of those things really lead to that certain communities will remain stigmatized and certain communities will be judged as if they're not fitting into what some define as the norm Australian society. And so in a very ironic twist of kind of logic, we blame those people who we not opened, and Sulian talked about people applying for jobs. We blame basically the victims who we've erected so many obstacles in front of them in terms of accessing opportunities. And we say, but you're not fitting. It's because you will never be like us. And that brings me to a fundamental flaw of the way we've seen multicultural politics play out, which is that we've never really understood or not accepted that it is a two-way, actually multi-way highway, not one-way highway. So then when migrants come and settle, whether Australia, Canada, UK, wherever, the expectations has always been that they need to assimilate, right? I'm using assimilate here deliberately. Whereas, as a matter of fact, the normal human expectation would be that if I'm exposed to difference, I also need to reflect my own understanding that the difference will change me, right? Not just I expect you to change and to conform to my own standards of values and behavior and all those things, but in any normal kind of polity, you would expect that the change will be really multi-directional, so that everyone makes allowances for that difference that every individual brings with them. And so that's where racism actually comes from, because there is an erroneous notion that some people simply do not want to adapt, integrate, and assimilate, a word that now is making a resurface, right? Whereas really, if we wanted to make significant progress in this kind of area, you would look at the education system. You would look at the way we are governed. You would look at the way we distribute economic opportunities in terms of everyone would have equal say, equal opportunity. And then all of those things together will really mean that everyone is working towards the same goal, which is mutual acceptance of the way we are, and also an understanding that we are all touched, impacted, and changed by notions of difference.
Well said, Fetty. But it's the question now is, where do we go? How do we change it in the way that we want to see it changed? Paul, what's your perspective when you've looked at Australia for a long time from the outside and visited regularly from a familiar but different country? Where do we go?
There's a couple of very interesting sort of contradictory things. I mean, I agree with Sue Lynn that young people in all countries are becoming more tolerant, believe very strongly in equality. And indeed, we have the British Social Attitudes Survey that's been done regularly over many years that shows, as I mentioned earlier, that across the whole population, people are becoming much more tolerant, not just about ethnicity and race, but about sexual identity and other forms of difference. But that doesn't mean that the inevitability of progress, because in certain places, in sort of certain communities, the opposite can happen because of perceptions of their life experience and what's happening to the community. And that's why I think the spatial matters, economics matters, but also it's not inevitable things will get better. So that's, I'd absolutely echo Fetty's sort of comment about, is there enough work around tolerance, about racism and tackling racism? And I think there never has been enough work on that. And I was struck with Robin's sort of point about sort of bonding and bridging, because that distinction has been at the heart of what's gone on with British policy over the past 20 years. Since 2001, the move of community cohesion or integration is not the death of multiculturalism. As I said, Tariq Madood's called it a rebalancing. It is a rebalancing because it's a focus on the bridging element as well. So a lot of the work at the local level has been contact theory work. So I did a big study of Oldham post-2001 riots, where the youth service was at the forefront of a lot of bridging activity. They weren't trying to deny the ethnic or faith backgrounds of the different communities, young people, but were trying to strengthen the commonality, the regional town commonality, but also the shared values and the shared needs for better employment routes, for better educational routes. And so that really rebalancing has been very, very important, I think. And I suppose the sort of message from Europe, again, to echo things I think all the colleagues have said, is that you can't take support for multiculturalism and for racial equality for granted. Because there are political actors, one of the big debates has been how far-right discourse about racial inequality has actually seeped into the mainstream via media outlets, but also, with what we call populism. And I agree with Fetty about the need to have more diverse leadership. I guess the UK's got very diverse governmental
Prime
leadership.
Minister, Home Secretary.
How's that going so far?
Yes.
So
I'm conscious of the fact we're at 7 o'clock, and if I don't throw the floor now, we're going to sort of run away without talking to ourselves. So let's take some questions or comments from the floor, but otherwise I'll go back to Sulin to pick up this question of representation and leadership. I mean, we're a long way from being where we should in terms of having leaders across every sector reflect the diversity we have in our society.
I think it's an area of work in my organization that we're very keen about, and trying to look at different ways that we can actually allow that to grow, and to get young people into the space of leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I talk about the kind of more informal forms of leadership, as well as the formal forms of leadership. So whether someone wants to run for local council or state government, or young people often don't see themselves as leaders, but they are what I would call local change makers, because they will say, I'm getting together with my friend to change my school policy because I don't believe in that policy, and to us, it's very racist. So there's a number of different spaces and places and sites where young people, what we would call, demonstrate leadership qualities. And I think that kind of representation is critical. And I think a lot of young people, the work that we do, underestimate what they can do as when they come together and work collectively. So we as an organization try and encourage and to grow those kind of spaces for young people. I think Fethy is right to a large extent too, because I think that kind of leadership is important in terms of racism, but also generally about multiculturalism. And I hear what was just said about representation. To me, it's not just about leadership. It's leadership. To me, it's about how we tackle racism that is not just at an individual level, because too often when we tackle racism at an individual level, it's the so-called, I don't want to use a binary notion here, but it's a so-called victim who does all the work. And people said, all right, we have got to set up reporting mechanisms that people can report racist incidents. Young people often say, it's too hard. How do I prove that that's racist? I've got no evidence. Unless it's a physical assault that someone else has recorded on the phone. But oftentimes it's not the physical, it's the words that hurt, the words that diminish, the words that is racist. So I think we need to think about systemically, how do we think about our institutions, our processes, our systems, our public policy? And I will go back to the word leadership. One of the things that's been missing, I think, for, in terms of hearing what young people are saying too, is the leadership. And even though I've just kind of discounted myself, it's not just about leadership, but it is about leadership in Australia, to stand up and call out racism when it does happen. So, but also to call out what I call racist public policies that diminishes a human being. And so we've had, which is now UK is adopting, which to our horror, stop the boats, send them back. Have we dehumanized people so much that it's become a good public policy? And I just think we should hang our head in shame for that. So that kind of leadership where we can stand up, where we do stand up, where our leaders do stand up, whether it's state government, federal government, local council level, local community leaders standing up to say, that's not good enough, I'm sorry. And not get penalized for it, not get rounded up, not get harassed by the cops, not get, those are the systemic instruments that the privileged in that sense and power how do we look at it systemically so that we do have, like you said, the fundamental right to freedom of speech, and the fundamental right to protest if we do need to protest, and the fundamental right to stand up and to have a considered but assertive and strong debate about public policies that affect us as a community. And I think this is where we want to give organizations like CMY, we want to grow that kind of confidence and skills for and with young people to have that voice. Because I think even though, even though it's a lot more diverse in this generation of young people in our community, you're absolutely right, Paul. It doesn't guarantee that multiculturalism will thrive and survive. But I think what it does guarantee for me is that it does guarantee a willingness to have conversations, a willingness to kind of open up and say, right, I don't quite understand why you would choose that course of action. Help me understand it. I think what we need to build is not an us and them binary conversation, but a conversation of curiosity, a conversation in Australia that we can be curious about the other without being demeaning about the other.
Yeah, no, that's a good and positive provocation. I think we should embrace curiosity and confidence to have conversations. Speaking of which, there's a couple of hands up, so we'll get a microphone to at the back. Over here, thanks, Kiara. Yeah, everything, everywhere, all at once, right, Celine?
Hello. I really don't like using microphones, so we'll see how this goes. And apologies in advance because I feel like this is going to be very inarticulate. But I was just reflecting on, I guess, a lot of what you had said and thinking about Australia as pretty much a racialized country when you think about our origins being the only white nation in an otherwise multiracial empire, thinking about the shift from the white Australia policy into what is broadly a policy of assimilation, and then to multiculturalism. Being a woman of color, which I don't like to use, but like going through school, being the only Black woman in my school of over 2,000 students in Sydney, growing up, having discussions about multiculturalism, that sort of thing, and then also working in the diversity inclusion space across university and other areas. I'm interested to know if you think we've almost skipped a step. I feel like there's some groundwork missing wherein the understanding of racism, how it occurs, where it occurs, isn't as nuanced in a country with such a cultural, multi-faith population, particularly when we have a lot of discussions, as it was brought up just now, we talk about racism at an interpersonal level rather than something that is ingrained, not by our choice, us now, but in our institutions, the laws that we hand down. And we talk about the effects on marginalized groups as unintended consequences, when realistically, that is something that has been part of the nation that we live in since its inception. So I feel in some ways, when I look at how we talk about multiculturalism now, particularly in terms of how it can be used to be divisive, when we think about Indigenous rights and the conversation that we're having now, it's sort of like, look at all these people here who've come from other places and they think it's all right and multiculturalism is really working. I think that in some ways it can hinder other conversations that I also think are quite important. So what my question is, if I can get there at some point, is do you think we've missed a step, and what can we do to remedy perhaps those gaps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Have we missed a step, and is there something we should be going back and looking at now to get right? And then we've got this, we have structural problems as well as personal experiences of racism that we need to fix.
Look, I feel what you are saying more than just I'm processing it, because I don't think a lot of people realize how devastating racism can be. I don't think many people know that. They think it's just, grow up, have a thick skin, you can deal with it. Trust me, and I've just a personal thing that happened to my family recently. It is exceptionally difficult to survive racism in terms of the trauma that it causes you. And it's even more difficult in our society nowadays to actually prosecute people on race, on hate motivated crime. I'm right now going through a case where my 10-year-old daughter was assaulted in a shopping center by someone who looked like a neo-Nazi. And for the last few weeks, we are struggling to actually prosecute a case against them. So I feel you. It is not actually about, I'm sorry to say this, it's not just about the curiosity. For some people, this is a life and death matter. It's not, it doesn't just deny you opportunities. It does. By all means, it does deny you opportunities. But for many people, it's much more serious than that. And I cannot imagine how you survived and how you navigated and how you managed to prosper and be who you are right now, having gone through schooling like that, as being the only person who of color and also being a woman. So I don't actually think, and I don't believe that we, in particular majoritarian groups, understand the monumental impact of racism. I don't think we do. And because we don't do, we still either deny it, or when we accept the fact, oh, there's racism, we actually show an indifference, which is morally quite atrocious in my view. We're indifferent to trying to change it. We're indifferent to trying to make sure that we put in place policies and legislative frameworks that have some oomph in the way of achieving justice. Remember what I said earlier? I said actually it's about justice, equality, and group differentiation. And you see those three themes, normative themes, you see them at play when things like this happen. When people are assaulted simply because they look different, where people are denied opportunities simply because their names are spelled or pronounced differently. And when people are denied a proper space for articulating or for having an identity that is extremely important to them, whether it's religious, cultural, whatever, it doesn't matter, the source of the identity. But so the step that we have skipped is deep institutional reform in Australia. We've jumped straight from a notion of celebration of diversity into, isn't it great that we can all live together, accept each other's difference? But scratch the surface and all the ugliness of racism and discrimination and exclusion and the politics of putting people down, and you see that it's still there, right? So as a society, and of course, comparatively, we do better than the UK. Great. But the UK doesn't do very well, actually. I'm sorry. We do much better than the US. Oh my gosh, is that the yardstick we want to compare ourselves with? Basically, we really come up short when you compare us to the optimal human experience that we all should have a right to experience and be entitled to live within. And I think, as I said, I never wanted to speak about my own, what's happened to us recently, but the frustration of seeing the system failing us. System is failing us. And the constables, the police constables, almost apologetic that there's not much they can do. I'm sorry. There's really not much we can do. So keep on, So that is why I think you're right when you say we skipped something. We skipped something that is monumentally important. And how do we get back there? This is for all of us to discuss.
We do need to change laws and fix things, don't we? And there is a danger of complacency and not being sufficiently upset with the way things are. We have to be properly disturbed that things aren't as they should be.
I think the curious conversation can happen in a certain context. I think we, at a point here in a racism, we actually do need to have, it's a non-tolerant approach. So I think it's a re-look at our systems, it's a re-look at our policies, our procedures. How do we live as a community? And how do we, and what can actually happen? Because time and again, I hear people say, I'm not reporting the incident because it's too hard to prove it. And I don't want to go through having to be the one that proves that something's happened to me. And a lot of the time, it slides. And I agree with you. I do not want a multicultural Australia, where it's just what I call the 3 Fs, food, flags, and festivals. I think we're all beyond that. We've got to scratch the surface a bit more and go, all right, great, food, flags, festival, let's recognize that, put that to one side. There's a time and place for that, but the real conversation, the real work has to be done outside the food flags and festival conversations. I look back in my family history and my own personal experience about racism, but also my family history around the systems. I think sometimes the system is so invisible to us. When my father tried to study here in the 1950s, late 50s forward, what was RMIT at that time? He registered for it. He thought, oh yeah, I want to do accounting. Turned up at RMIT. He thought he would just give it a go. A person very blatantly said to him, I'm sorry, it's only reserved for whites. You can't apply for this course. It was during the White Australia policy, and it was very the system was systemic right throughout. So that was just the given, the taken. So for me nowadays, I look at the system. How do I not assume and not just take what's given and question it? And I think the people who questioned it in those days, we've moved away from the White Australia policy, thank God. But I think there's still strands of it in there that is so invisible that we don't know how to shine a light on it. And I think that needs to be done.
Yeah, there are some inconvenient truths we need to face up to, right? Yeah. I mean, John Howard famously, of course, spoke a bit against a black armband view of history, as he's put it. But of course, he was part of the problem that we deny problems with our history.
I've been provocative and say, I think there's a tactical consideration. This is a politician speaking, but a former politician. I think people like John Howard loved a black arm view of history. They just loved opposing it. So I think for people who oppose racism, and I'll tell a personal story. My wife did change her name to get jobs. She has a Chinese name. She changed it in to apply for jobs. But I think we have to be very careful as people who wish to fight racism and buttress diversity, multiculturalism, and in fact a free society, because that's at the heart of it. You're free to define yourself in a free society and choose your identity. From authoritarians and bigots, because they're very good at exploiting their responses to their ideas. So I think there's a consideration, which is how do you successfully respond to what are effectively traps laid by people who really want a response. In fact, often the political engagements are to generate a response which will be ineffective politically. And you see that in some areas of the media, you certainly see it in some political circles. So I think how people respond to inequality, to racism, and it's a difficult thing to do if you're a victim. So I'm not blaming people who are not taking this into consideration. But there are those who wish to divide societies. And it's a very live issue across democratic societies of the world. I mean, literally forces trying to destroy free democratic societies across the world. Want a response to their provocations, which creates the circumstances that they can exploit. And this is a very germane issue at the moment. And so in responding to the needs for more equality and responding against racism, I think it's really important to consider how those responses will be used by the opponents of multiculturalism. How do we use those who seek to foster division? How those who wish to use historical discourses to divide societies and to cast some out of the family, of the community, which is couldn't think of a much more reprehensible thing to do. So it's really important to try and address those issues. It's really important to do so in a way that doesn't assist the demagogues, the populists, and those who seek to divide, because they're waiting. They are very alive to those issues, and they in fact welcome those debates because they're prepared. And they spend a lot of time thinking about messaging. They think a lot of time, framing is the term used in politics. They think a lot of time thinking about framing in order to strike. So it's critical. And to go to, I'll leave, I don't want to be too negative because I think they're ultimately going to lose because of the sort of intrinsic inhumanity of some of the positions that they take. But the visceral human experience of bigotry is extraordinarily powerful, and most people will immediately, decent human beings who might be unconsciously racist often in their lives, but do so in an unconscious way, will gravitate towards action to prevent that. So the community of process is important. And it is really important to have experiences, but you'll have, if it involves someone who's lost relative economic and social position in the society and self-identifies as white, and then hearing that white people are oppressing, they turn around and say, well, hang on, I'm losing. How dare you say that I'm, and the populace sweep in, who of course often not from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think we have to be really careful how to respond.
Can I just jump in very, very quickly, just to give you an example of what can be done if you have the right leadership? So we've just celebrated recently Harmony Day. So actually Harmony Day internationally is not called Harmony Day. It is explicitly focused on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. So in Australia, instead of reinforcing that message that we are, as a community, as a society, as a government, we are for eliminating all forms of racial discrimination, what do? We make it a celebration light day. Oh, let's celebrate Harmony Day. So everyone thinks that everything is fine, everything is great, we have no problems with racism. Whereas we do have, as I said earlier, the research has consistently shown that we had a small proportion of the community, and it's growing over time. And why it's growing, there's all sorts of reasons, of course, that Robin has touched upon some of them. But in my view, the 1975 Anti-Racism Discrimination Act, which was initially a good thing. I mean, who would not want to have the 1975 Act? It has not been really updated. It has not been giving more, if you like, strength in terms of dealing with the kind of racism that we are seeing nowadays in our society, happening across platforms, digitally, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and we're not doing that work. That's my problem with this population.
Yeah, and Robin, as you've said, if these things are too important for us to get them wrong, so we need to be outraged and stirred to action, but we also need to be smart about the way we engage to try and bring about change. Paul, do you have any words of insight that are going to save us?
No, but I was going to say there's a lot of British young people, particularly from Black backgrounds, who feel that there's been a step missed as well. And that's why I think the Black Lives Matter movement was quite strong in Britain as well, because the sort of discriminatory indicators for people of African background have not shifted at all in Britain. So, racism.
Yeah, and then
has not been
in a declining economy with geographic problems.
We've got a similar feeling that we've done too much celebrating and not enough enforcement of legal measures.
Yeah, you can't argue with that. We've got time for a couple of questions on the floor. I know we're almost out of time, but Balgang and Mark, I think you had your hand up. Perhaps we'll take the questions together so we can efficiently. Oh, okay, yes.
Thank you. So we know that British no longer adopt the term multiculturalism. US State Department of Justice also don't adopt this term. And in Canada, Australia, government both still use this term. So I wonder, how do we explain this phenomenon, or just leave the European aside? How do we explain this phenomenon? And whether there's one kind of historical macro explanation is to look at the empire and the center and the peripheral. So British is really empire at the center. So it's for them difficult to adopt this kind of defending multicultural. For peripheral state like Australia, Canada, easily can adjust the culture, defend this kind of multicultural. Do you think this kind of explanation is feasible? How do we explain this phenomenon?
I'll take a couple. Thanks, Balgam. That's a really, really nice provocation, because there's so much in that to engage with. We were talking earlier about end of empire and sentiment, but I'll take Mark's question, and Chiara, you've got questions from the online.
Yes, yeah.
Well, perhaps Mark.
My question, I think, thinking of what Paul was saying and Robin about the kind of geographic and social and economic differences, while we're talking about the UK and Australia, they're quite distinct parts. So, for instance, in Australia, in this state in Victoria, we have, Victorian Multicultural Act of 2011 passed by, Conservative government, by all members of Parliament, with statements in it, quite explicitly valuing the richness that such diversity brings. And that's a great comment. Now, there's a question there whether such aspirations actually translate into change on the ground, but also in the UK, there's no such statements. And yet, while it's a city with multiple problems, London is probably in its own way, one of the world's, most multicultural cities in terms of its values actually are making money more than anything else. So it's interesting that you can have, within different countries, quite distinct approaches to this. And in Victoria, we have a lot of legislation and policy, which is great and probably world's best practice in what's written. Maybe there's difference in practice. In Britain, there's an absence of policy, and yet people who have a common purpose in making lots of money sometimes have a different approach.
Speaking about prime ministers, Chiara, we'll pick up the questions from the online group first, and then go back to our panel before colleagues.
We've got one from Annie, who's interested in further comment from Professor Thomas regarding the use of racial difference in place of class analysis.
Okay. Was there other questions there? Or...
There are, but they're a little bit long.
Okay.
Maybe you want to answer that one first.
Okay, because we probably will have just one last throw to the panel. So whatever questions there are now, we'll put up so that the panel to engage with, which is a bit tough because there's hardly time to engage with one of the questions.
Michelle Grossman has said, Paul Thomas's quote on parallel lives could apply equally to Jewish diaspora communities at various points in various countries, or to the historical Irish diaspora in many parts of the US. Yet these parallel lives were often celebrated by mainstream politicians for their self-sufficiency and maintenance of cultural heritage. What role does race or ethnicity then play in why some parallel lives are seen as threats rather than benign formations?
Another easy question. That's good.
Yeah.
Good question. I think that's enough for our questions. We're almost out of time, but it is good to engage with these I guess, really structural questions of trying to explain how we've got here, because that's part of trying to figure out where we go, how we get to a better place. Cool.
So firstly, in response to Michelle's question, that's exactly our point about sort of urban studies and about how long it takes for communities to integrate. That we see this with communities in all sorts of situations. The question about race and class, one concrete example. The UK, to answer Mark, has laid down lots of policies on top of each other rather than one overt statement. So we do ethnically monitor everything, all aspects of public policy. So we ethnically monitor how students do at education, but we don't monitor how they do by their social class. So it does lead to saying that, like, if less Bangladeshi origin young people are doing well than the norm, that must be because of their Bangladeshiness or because of racial barriers. And of course, some of that is about racism, but there's a danger that we're actually measuring class and poverty rather than ethnicity. So the total absence of one, so in public policy, that's one example, but also in political discourse, there's been much more focus on ethnicity rather than class, because people in power don't want to focus on class.
As you say, we've got structural problems we need to fix. Robin?
I was just going to respond to Michelle's. I mean, up till the 1950s, well, in fact, up to the 70s, in one sense, with sectarianism, the Irish were a threat in a lot of perception. So sort of these things change over time. I mean, in 1917, we had the debates on conscription in Australia. I think there was a very strong view amongst particular sort of loyalist Protestant views that the Irish were a sort of fifth column and, were undermining the war effort, and were a divisive element. And right through the 50s, the Labor Party famously split in the 1950s over sectarian issues in Victoria. So I think these things evolve over time, to take up something that Paul mentioned. And so these things that seem benign, and at St. Patrick's Day and people having a beer or some green beer, once were an extraordinarily controversial element of the society with people's difference around ethnicity and particularly religion. And Victoria was one of the most sectarian places in the world for a long time, where people with different religions only worked in different departments. You couldn't get a job in the agriculture department if you weren't Catholic, for example, if I'm remembering correctly. You know, it's like there were, and vice versa with others with Protestants. So sort of we have another history when people talk about these things, which sort of so these things do evolve over time.
That's a slightly hopeful note, I think, perhaps. Yeah. Sulin?
Just one last comment about class. I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that migrant communities, whether people come here under, humanitarian visas or skilled migrant visas or, the whole plethora of different types of visa forms, but it's actually quite important because how they come into Australia is also dependent on a bit, with the exception of humanitarian entrance, dependent on class, because you do need money to come into Australia. So migrants who come into Australia also bring their own class and their own class biases. And that's something that we don't often talk about or to unpack a bit more. So, if I can bring my own personal experience, I can hear in my head, my family's very biased comments about different types of Chinese who come from different parts of, depending on which part of the world you come from. And so I think it's a very class thing, but on the outside, people often, the Australian community look at us and go, oh, Chinese community. I think, to me, that's important because I think sometimes we make the assumptions that people who join up with conservative political parties are not the migrant communities. And I would say, I think, relook at those assumptions again. Yes.
I think the UK reminds us of that. I think what we've taken from tonight, apart from the fact we shouldn't give up on optimism, is that we have some serious hard truths to face up to and some hard work to do. And it's not fair, Fetty, to ask you to tell us which way forward, but you are the last speaker on the panel, and we should leave with some sense of what we can actually do.
Yeah, I think just going back to Balgan, and he makes a very pertinent point in relation to the notion of empire. And I just want to remind all of us that a lot of the what I call pro-diversity policies have actually emerged within very specific socio-political contexts. So in the context of Canada was really the whole situation of Quebec, in Australia, coming out of the White Australia policy and wanting to manage migration. In the UK and Europe, by and large, so in the UK, of course, there is the notion of empire and how immigrants into the UK initially were part of that project. But more recently, it was all about politics of managing diversity post 9/11 in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. So my positive take on all of this is, yes, multiculturalism has served a particular purpose for a number of decades. But what we are learning now through research and through developing indices for looking at diversity governance is that there is a missing element within multiculturalism, that it's not missing in the sense that it is there, but has not been explicitly pursued, which is the intercultural contact, which is bringing communities together, which is ensuring that the education system teaches things to do with cultural understanding. And I think that's where a lot of the current debates in international scholarship, I should add, is wanting to go. That is, maintain what has served the multicultural agenda within multiculturalism and recalibrate that and reinvigorate that through new strategies that really emphasize that coming together, the bidirectional exchange, if you like. And I think that is very hopeful, that is very positive. And we do obviously want to see more jurisdictions really kind of adopt some of those strategies, which would really lead to positive attitudinal change.
And those are things we can do. I mean, these are not impossible things. It's a very reasonable request, isn't it? So I guess we work in the education industry. We need to be taken on board ourselves. I wish we had more time for more discussions. All I can say is we will have more public policy forums. The next one will be in May with Lydia Khalil talking about her book on the far right. And we don't want to put all of our discussion into that direction, but I think there's space to loop back later this year to some of these issues because we haven't finished this conversation yet and it's too important to leave unfinished. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panel.